There have always existed fandoms, clubs that are exclusivist by the nature of their interests and not because they banned anyone, weird circles, and so on and so forth. But those always existed alongside the real world, and their members would spend a few days a month or maybe a few weeks a year wrapped into that marginal world and then afterwards join the rest of us in reality. That has changed with the internet, which gave rise to a permanent class of people metaphorically glued to their computer. Nevertheless, that was still a small group, so it was tolerable. Besides, they still had to eat, and for that they still had to work, so it was all still manageable. But then the issue got compounded by the rise of social media and smartphones, which led not only to an increase of the problem, but also facilitate a very long delay to any meaningful answer. We call these people terminally online. Unfortunately, though, while it is very easy to blame the internet or social media for that, in reality the issue is even deeper. It is very difficult to know which came first, the prolonged adolescence as the norm or the terminally online. Perhaps they evolved together. I don't know, and quite frankly, it doesn't even matter at this point. The phenomena are clearly connected and deserve a bit of exploration, not only because the results are despicable from a civilizational perspective, but because the misery and the negative trade-offs that come with being terminally online are finally hitting the terminally online people themselves, and no amount of copium can solve that. It's time to explore the issue while being explicitly judgmental about it. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is in a way the why you must touch grass video. So as usual, first we define the terms, then we bring up some examples, then look at the trade-offs, and at the end I'll bring some opinions. What qualifies me to opine on this issue is the fact that I've been making the majority of my income somehow related to the online world, while at the same time not becoming terminally online in the last 15 years. So when I critique, I do it from a tough love standpoint rather than a shaming standpoint. I think the terminally online people have already had their deserved share of shaming. Not that they don't deserve it, but you get the point. Okay, so definitions. Conventionally, terminally online refers to individuals closely engaged with the internet culture. Now, I don't particularly like that definition because it is outdated, not to mention needlessly reductionist. There's no denying that over the last decade, internet culture is now a much broader term. In 2012, it meant knowing some memes from 4chan. In 2023, it means a lot of marginal things like anything going on Twitch, e-celebs, drama, and so on and so forth. But it also means hearings in the Congress with former or current executives of big social media companies.
How many FBI agents worked at Twitter while you were there?
I don't believe any active FBI agents.
Former FBI agents, how many worked there while you were there?
I'm aware of perhaps 2.
Well, we know of at least 9 because they started the BU group chat, BU for Bureau. Now, Mr. Roth, did the FBI ever ask you to share information like users' communication data without going through proper legal channels?
No, they did not, and I would have refused if they had.
That's correct. I see that you denied Agent Chan's request for access to Twitter's data feed. What's sick isn't that you would deny it, it's that the FBI would even ask you for the private data of American citizens without going through legal channels of the law. Ms. Gaddy, did either of you approve the shadow banning of my account at Lauren Boebert? Yes or no?
No, I did not.
Not to the best of my recollection.
Well, let me refresh your memory, because on March 12th, 2021, and Mr. Roth, I know you looked at it because Fascist Twitter 1.0 had a public interest exceptions policy, which means for members of Congress to be shadow banned, it had to go before you, Mr. Roth. So I'll ask again, did you shadow ban my account, yes or no?
Again, not to the best of my recollection.
So the answer is, Mr. Roth, yes, you did. I found out last night from Twitter staff that you suppressed my account for this tweet. It's a freaking joke about Hillary Clinton being angry that she couldn't rig her election. It's a joke, but in response, being the sinister overlords that you all are, you placed a 90-day account filter so I could not be found. And now we see here that Twitter staff said the visibility filter on my account excluded me from top searches, prevented notifications for non-followers, and much more. This is considered an aggressive visibility filter. You silenced members of Congress from communicating with their constituents. You silenced me from communicating with the American people over a freaking joke. Now, who the hell do you think that you are?
If you had told anyone in 2012 that in 2023 we'll be having elected officials screeching in the Congress about their tweets being censored, everyone would have looked at you like you were crazy. And quite frankly, it is crazy. But such is the current world, where aspects previously belonging to the terminally online are now mainstream discussion in taxpayer-funded forums. The other way around is also true. Very offline activities, such as shooting your guns or driving trains, now find their way into the blob, colloquially and increasingly improperly named internet culture. This is why I will define terminally online as follows. Individual, closely aligned and engaged with topics that cease to exist and cease to produce notable or relevant effects upon reality once you shut down the computer or put the goddamn phone down. Although this definition is imperfect too, it is better than the conventional one, because it excludes topics that exist almost exclusively online, but who do produce relevant effects upon reality even if one stops engaging them. I'm thinking here at the religious extremist cult of transgenderism, which went from a terminally online topic 10 years ago in the days of Tumblr to a very real topic that is systematically mutilating and sterilizing children. Someone being interested in protecting children from this cult isn't necessarily terminally online, and most definitely not part of the critique of this video. The other definition that we need for this video is prolonged adolescence. Now, nothing speaks more of the existence of the phenomenon than the increasing mainstreamization of the word tween to mean late teenagers and 20-somethings. The word tween used to refer to pre-adolescent children, and officially, to the extent we can talk about officially when it comes to the English language, it still means that. But increasingly, bit by bit, this second meaning is gaining traction, and it's gaining traction because there's a market for it. The problem with prolonged adolescence is that it is routinely approached and defined in schizophrenic terms. The far-left outlet The Atlantic has an article out in January 23 defining the issue strictly in terms of violence. The same outlet in 2016 was singing the praises of prolonged adolescence and blatantly set it out that it's okay if one's adulthood starts in their 30s. And that is crazy. So, for the purposes of this talk, we shall define prolonged adolescence as follows. Consistent maintenance of otherwise childlike interests, thoughts, activities, hobbies, and thought patterns past the age of 20. This definition is a bit complex, but it has to be because the issue is also a complex one. I found a very good description as an example for thought patterns that can be described as prolonged adolescence. I found it on the American Conservative blog. The author quotes someone else who is unnamed, so I don't know who to credit, but here it goes, quote, "If the death of a character on your favorite TV show affects you more than the death of your cousin, that might be a sign that you should reorient your focus. And I would suggest that we should also be aware that fiction, like all distractions, can be addictive if our mundane lives lack joy," unquote. This description perfectly encapsulates terminally online prolonged adolescence people. As you can see, I'm purposefully leaving out from the definition some of the common tropes about prolonged adolescence, since, for instance, I'm neither an Anglo nor a Scandinavian, so I don't think people not moving out from their parents' house as soon as they turn 18 is a bad thing. I don't believe that at all. I think that kind of expectation is crazy in itself, even though I did just that, which in my country is an anomaly. But I did it because it made perfect economic sense for me. I could have made more money by leaving, but if the equation had looked differently, I might have made different choices. What I'm concerned with here when discussing prolonged adolescence is thought patterns, personality molding activities and interests. In other words, how the individual gets to function for himself, not just in relation to others, but also that too. Not so much the individual's economic achievements or lack thereof. That is of little importance. Alright, so with the definitions out of the way, let's cut to the chase. If you're a man older than 19 and know everything there is to know about the lore of 20 video games but not how to fix your indoor plumbing, you are a terminally online man-child who, yes, should be ashamed, not praised. If you're a woman older than 19 and know everything there is to know about the controversy surrounding the movie Don't Worry Darling but nothing about how to cook a tasty meal, you are a terminally online child who, yes, should be ashamed and not praised. And no, I have no idea what Don't Worry Darling is. I just googled terminally online and found this amazing article from an Italian magazine headlined "In Defense of Being Terminally Online," an article written by a terminally online woman who tries to excuse her inadequacy in the real world and complains that she can't have a conversation with her husband, who is a normal person. To her credit, though, she does acknowledge that her husband's mental health is very likely better. And that's the first step towards improving things if you find yourself in these descriptions, acknowledging that you do have a problem. And as cliché as this may sound, it turns out, even to my surprise, that it's shockingly hard for so many. It's just a hobby, says the terminally online gamer, whose last conversation with a real person, not his roommate, was last year. It's not an expensive hobby, says the terminally online gamer that just spent $1,000 on a video card that he'll likely use at full capacity maybe 10 times before replacing it yet again. But it's not just games or gamers. All customers of OnlyFans are in the same category. All those who spend an inordinate amount of time on Twitter, or even worse, TikTok, are in the same category. If you know more about the latest internet drama than about the details of your house, you have a problem. A few days ago, I went to visit someone, a terminally online chap who had an epiphany. He was trying to tell me about some Eliza, whatever, and something, Tim Pool, something, and I was like, oh my god, who the hell cares? So, I saw something about that in passing on Twitter, but true to my philosophy that bits on the screen don't matter, I simply scrolled over and never gave it a second thought. I can assure you, I lead a very good life not knowing anything more about yet another internet drama. So, annoyed by this guy's terminally online topics of interest, I went to the kitchen to find an ashtray, and in doing so I discovered quite a serious defect in his kitchen. One that, if left unchecked, would have put this chap under serious financial stress, because once the pipe would have finally burst, it would have borked not just his apartment, but the neighbors too. That's when he had an epiphany, because the defect looked as if it had been visible for weeks, yet he had not seen it, in part because his eyes were rarely anywhere else than on the goddamn screen. Okay, but so what? Sure, being a terminally online adolescent is probably bad, but so what? Individuals choose that, and who are you, the fat sofa man, to judge, right? Well, two reasons. One is systemic and one is individual. The systemic reason is that some of this problem is amplified by intentional systemic decisions. For instance, a lot of video games today have effectively become casinos. So-called in-game transactions, or microtransaction, or however they're called, are effectively gambling. And they elicit the same kind of brain-addictive response as classical gambling, with the added benefit for the house that there are no rules. The internet is full of stories of children spending a crap ton of money using their parents' credit or debit cards to buy items in video games. If a casino would allow 15-year-olds to play the roulette with money they know was stolen from their parents, the casino would rightfully be shut down. But for some reason, the same logic can't be applied to video games that are grooming children into gambling. Conservatives are afraid to make this argument because there's a history of conservatives being stupid in public with regards to video games. And leftists don't want to make this argument because the video game industry is a significant financial contributor to the left. But the stupidity of conservatives in the past and the hypocrisy of the left in the present notwithstanding, the fact remains that quite a bunch of highly popular video games are no longer a product that you buy, but an infinite loop of gambling that should be subjected to the same regulations as casinos and slot machines. This game of pretense that buying loot boxes is somehow different from slot machines would be funny, if not so dangerous. And the reason the game of pretense continues is because this monstrosity has much more powerful lobbyists than casinos. You see, Google and Apple take 30% of each transaction, so it is in their direct interest to continue this way. Same goes for social media, which monetizes attention, so it will feed you more and more terminally online crap for you to react on. So this part is systemic. That is to say, part of the reason this whole discussion matters is because the issue is not always full consensual choice of individual. The other reason is, however, individual. Yes, quite a few individuals choose to become terminally online for various reasons. And in some cases, one could make the argument that it's none of anyone else's business. Fine. However, there are trade-offs. And once those individuals hit the trade-offs, things get really ugly really fast. And this is where I think everyone is failing. The mainstream response is schizophrenic. It's either, oh, it's just some fun, or it's just a hobby, it doesn't harm anyone, so why do you care? Or it's full on, all gaming or social media or whatever is evil and divisive and a threat to democracy. Now, while there is an argument to be made that social media is evil, that cat ain't going back to the bag. The internet will likely re-balkanize for a while, but we're not going back to the era where we all watched the same 3-4 shows last night and talk about them. That's just not going to happen. But the far more pernicious claim that all of this is harmless fun is the reason things continue to get worse. The outright refusal to discuss the trade-offs is a tragedy in and of itself. You see, it's not like there is a conspiracy or anything. It's all out in the open. In order to make money, companies monetizing attention strive to do their best to keep you glued to the screen. In the past, the techniques were more primitive in the sense that they'd have to deliver a very good story that your brain would latch on because they couldn't monitor in real time whether you're still around or not. And besides, they already sold you the product, be it the movie, the video game, or the board game, or whatever. So the investment in techniques to keep you glued was an investment rather in the future. Maybe you buy the next edition too, or the sequel, or the prequel, or whatever. This has held true from the late 1700s, when mass distribution of print started to become a thing, until less than 20 years ago. The internet, and in particular mobile internet, changed all of that. Now it's entirely possible for the creator to follow in real time and adjust accordingly. So in a very short period of time, the techniques improved in a few years more than they had improved in the previous 100 years. And this comes with trade-offs that the human brain is not inherently equipped to deal with because evolutionarily speaking, we've never seen this before. So what trade-offs? Well, the abrupt drop in attention span, for starters. A lot more pronounced in the West than in the rest of the world, but still quite evident everywhere. I was watching the other day a video by an American YouTuber talking about the censorship going on in Russia and how independent commentators found workarounds to continue to publish their videos. And he was surprised to find 2 hours or even longer videos that get big audiences. He was genuinely surprised because to American youngsters, paying attention to something for 2 hours is unheard of. And that's the second trade-off of a terminally online existence. Being distracted as a norm. And again, some of that is systemic, but the individual still bears some responsibility. Quite frankly, I find it terrifying each time I see some of these early 20s going out on a date, and they both stay with their eyes on their fucking phones. And then they both, later on, could be days or years, end up complaining that they're leading a sexless life. Well, I'm sorry, but you can either get laid or scroll through your TikTok feed. No, you can't have them both. Not at the same time, anyway. That's the nature of a trade-off. I'll get to the sex recession too, hopefully also this month, but for now I will say this. The terminally online will have to grapple with the trade-offs sooner or later. You can kick the can down the road, but there's no escape. Just like with everything else in life, something is gotta give. Just saying. And that is one big issue these days. In the past, and by that I mean very recent past, such as as late as 2010, it was understood that video games are more or less for children, and it was rightfully regarded as weird to see grown-ups spending nights playing video games instead of tending for their responsibilities as adults. Heck, in the last 10 years we saw another word change its meaning. 45 years ago, adulting was the verbal form for the noun adultery. Nowadays, adulting is used to describe being a normal adult, but from the perspective that such thing is weird. That was not a choice imposed, but a choice made by terminally online adults and now routinely imposed upon everyone else. And again, none of this would be a problem if all the trade-offs had been properly understood and internalized. You want to be a terminally online child at age 30? Have at it. Your money, your time, your body, your choice, as it were. The problem is that the vast majority of the terminally online wake up one day that they don't like the trade-off and then lash out at everyone else, including and especially at those who point out the trade-off. It may have sounded cool 15 years ago, a la Revenge of the Nerds thingy, to mainstream being a terminally online nerd. But the fact of the matter is that it's far from cool, far from beneficial, and also a good indicator as to why it was a terribly bad idea to let the nerds out of the closet to begin with. But that's a story for another day. Okay, so what to do? Well, as someone counseling formerly terminally online adults trying to get back among us in reality, I think I can speak with some minor authority. You see, our brain is a muscle too. If you don't train it, it atrophies just like any other muscle. So if you don't train the part that deals with social skills, they atrophy. And the response is, like with everything else, practice. If you spend 10 years as a couch potato, perhaps regular 10 minutes walks aren't a terrible idea. Then 20 minutes walks and so on and so forth. Definitely not going into bodybuilding though, not overnight. In the same vein, if your habits have become too introverted and too focused on the unreal, whether it's fiction stories, TV shows, video games and so on, you need to slowly yet steadily spend more time on things that pull you out of that. A phone call to a relative, a brief conversation with a stranger at the convenience store, those might be good first steps. Most definitely not a speaking engagement in front of 1,000 people, that's for sure. And yes, it will feel like work at first, just like with physical exercise, but the more time you spend at it, the more you'll come to enjoy doing things that involve real human interaction. And yes, discipline is also needed. That's where mentors can be of great help. Someone that you trust and, even better, that you respect. Someone whose authority you're willing to observe, and that someone, yes, should have the authority to take your phone away. Soon enough, that won't be needed, but for sure, it will be needed at first. For instance, I regard it as rude for someone to text while talking to me. Unless your mother died, your house is on fire, or you're the prime minister of a country, you have no excuse to text or check your phone at all while you're having a conversation with me. And I rigorously enforce this. At first, the interlocutor sees this as a dick move or a rude move, but it doesn't take long for some of them to realize that it's the first conversation in years that they had without interference. And that also needs practice. After years of consistent interference from social media, way too many have come to regard this as normal, but it's not and it never has been. Cell phones have been around for almost 30 years already, yet for the first 20 years it was absolutely rude for your phone to ring, or even worse, for you to respond while having a physical conversation with someone else. It's really a very recent phenomenon that it's somehow no big deal that one spends half of the conversation with a real human texting. But it is a big deal. Not only because it's rude, but also because you're wasting the other person's time. And nobody has a duty to kowtow to your terminally online habits. Not for free, anyway. Ultimately, the key here is moderation and boundaries. The choice is not between becoming Amish or plugging into the Matrix. The choice is between boundaries and lack of boundaries. Too many people, especially the young, though not just the young, drifted way too far from reasonable boundaries and moderation. According to a US survey from 2022, 73% of Zoomers play video games regularly, while only 27% fit the normal people category of sometimes and never. The same survey claims that 46% of Americans overall spend no more than 1 to 3 hours gaming in a row, a trend consistent across respondents of all ages, and only 4% of Americans regularly play game marathons that run 13 or more hours. Now, the 4% definitely need psychiatric help at this point, that's for sure. But that still leaves about 20%, it's 68% in total of Americans who game. But that still leaves 20% of Americans who fit somewhere between 3 hours and 12 hours. Those people also need serious intervention. I'm sorry, there's no way you can convince me that this is moderate, reasonable adult behavior to spend 4 hours a day or more playing video games. That's more than the equivalent of a part-time job, for crying out loud. That's a lot more than just a harmless hobby. The survey also says that Gen X gamers were split evenly between 8 to 12 hours and 1 to 3 hours per week. Now, 1 to 3 hours per week, now that's a harmless hobby. 8 to 12 hours a week, that's already a bit too much, but still within reason. However, as I kept saying throughout this video, it's not just video games, it's screen time overall, as it's called. The average American spends 7 hours and 4 minutes looking at a screen every day. Make no mistake, this includes the working class that doesn't work in an office. The so-called pandemic made things even worse than they already were. A study from Anglia Ruskin University found that children's screen time increased dramatically. 90% of Canadian children were exceeding the recommended 2-hour a day limit, while Tunisian children aged 5 to 11 increased their screen time by a whopping 111%. Another study by the University of California, San Francisco found that US adolescent screen time doubled during the pandemic. Researchers found that 12 to 13-year-old children in the US doubled their non-school related screen time to 7.7 hours in May 2020 compared to just 3.8 hours before branch Covidianism. There's no way you can convince me that any of this is healthy. In fact, we predicted on the sofa 3 years ago that this will end up badly. And now slowly, even the New York Times has to admit that the sofa was right. The mental health of the young has gone south in ways that were totally predictable and avoidable, which is one of the many reasons why I continue to sue and purposefully make the lives of branch Covidians as hard as I am legally and logistically able. These people are the enemy outright. Ultimately, if we, collectively and individually, don't rediscover moderation, things will continue to get worse. And keep in mind, this is not an exclusively Western or a developed country problem. In fact, the biggest consumers of screen time are in Africa and South America, followed closely by India. Ironically, the digital totalitarian country of China has a lower average screen time than the global median, though admittedly not by much. But one important step towards improving things is acknowledging the problem. This is all new anyway. There are no long-term studies on just how harmful all of this is, but judging by what's seen so far, it's quite reasonable to assume the worst. And it's one of the reasons I don't own a smartphone. When I leave my office, that means I'm not online. And that's a hard limit. Without consent, almost, way too many of our fellow citizens have just internalized the assumption that one is always online, to such an extent that some countries adopt legislation on the right to log off in order to get rid of the nagging by employers. But it's not legislation that we all need. At least not in this department, though gambling legislation should absolutely be enforced on the gaming industry. But what we all need is simply to remember how we used to do things in 2010. We all had internet in 2010 and social media, but globally we'd spend far less time per day in front of a screen. So ask yourself this: do you really need to be on 10 platforms? Do you really need to be on 15 apps? Because a lot of that bulk of screen time, globally speaking, is used simply to check the notifications of the 7 accounts that each person holds. On average, worldwide, a person has 7.5 accounts. Brazilians have 8.7 social media accounts on average. That is crazy. That's another reason why on Freedom Alternative we don't require people to create accounts with our services. We don't want to contribute to the problem, even though it would surely be easier to manage things, but just because it's easier, it doesn't mean it's right. And I didn't even go into the narcissism aspect. The terminally online crowd is hitting reality in increasingly harsh ways. Forget the gamers, take a look, if you can stomach, at Instagrammers and TikTokers. These people whose sense of self-worth and sense of self in general is entirely dependent on their number of followers and likes. That is to say, on external factors which aren't even real. It's all just bits on someone else's server. Some of them even go into arguments with strangers, and they're quite shocked when they realize that up over here in the real world, nobody gives a flying fuck that you're an influencer with 100 million followers. Get lost. None of this will end well. But what you can do at an individual level is to be aware of the problem and address it for yourself and for your tribe. And yes, your tribe. You should have that all the time. You'll need it. So yeah. I think I ranted enough. It's a topic that is developing, basically. Most of its aspects aren't new, that's why I'm confident in the predictions. But the scale is definitely much bigger than previous iterations, which is precisely why it's a serious issue. And until we can discuss systemic trade-offs and policies, well, first a lot more of y'all need to clean your rooms. Alright, that's it. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.